Sacramento, California, 1977. While the world was focused on the Son of Sam in New York, a different kind of terror was brewing in the suburbs of California. Richard Chase was a man who lived in a state of constant, terrifying delusion. He was convinced that his blood was turning to powder and that his heart was shrinking. To save himself, he began to believe he needed to consume the life force of others. It started with small animals, but soon the neighborhood began to notice something was wrong with the man who lived in the apartment on Watt Avenue. He had been institutionalized before, and doctors had warned that he was a danger to himself and others, but due to a lack of space and a misunderstanding of his condition, he was released back into society. It was a mistake that would cost several lives. Chase's method of choosing victims was completely random. He didn't stalk people for weeks, and he didn't use complicated traps. Instead, he would simply walk down a street and try the front door handles of various houses. In his twisted mind, an unlocked door was an invitation. If the door was locked, he believed he wasn't welcome and would move on. But if the door opened, he saw it as a sign that he was supposed to enter. This test is one of the most chilling parts of the case. It meant that for the people of Sacramento, the only thing standing between them and a monster was a simple deadbolt. In January 1978, he found his first invitation at the home of Teresa Wallin, and the city's peace was shattered forever. The violence escalated with terrifying speed. Just days after his first attack, Chase entered the home of Evelyn Myroth. It was a scene of chaos that left 4 people dead, including a young child. The crime scenes were so disturbing that even veteran police officers had to step outside to compose themselves. The FBI's behavioral science unit was called in. They realized they weren't looking for a calculated genius like Edmund Kemper. They were looking for a disorganized killer. Someone who was living in filth, likely unemployed, and suffering from severe psychosis. They predicted the killer would live within walking distance of the crime scenes. They were right. The search narrowed down to a single apartment complex where neighbors had already complained about a man who looked like he hadn't slept or bathed in months. When police finally raided Richard Chase's apartment, they found the physical manifestation of his delusions. The walls and floors were stained, and his refrigerator was filled with evidence of his horrific diet. He was arrested while trying to flee with a box of evidence. In court, his defense argued that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, but the jury found that his ability to flee and hide evidence showed he understood his crimes were wrong. He was sentenced to death, but died in his cell in 1980. The case of Richard Chase changed how the FBI looked at mental illness and crime. It taught investigators that the most dangerous person isn't always the one with a plan. Sometimes it's the person who has completely lost touch with reality and acting on a logic that only they can understand. Most serial killers are lone wolves, but in 1979, the California coast was haunted by a duo. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris met behind the bars of a California prison. Bittaker was the mastermind, highly intelligent, cold, and dominant. Norris was the follower, a man with a dark history who was easily influenced by Bittaker's charisma. While in prison, they didn't talk about rehabilitation. They talked about the plan. They spent their time sketching out a design for a specialized van and making a list of the tools they would need. They weren't planning a robbery or a heist. They were planning a spree of violence that would target the teenagers of Los Angeles. When they were paroled, the world saw 2 men who had paid their debt to society. In reality, society was about to pay the price for their release. Once free, the pair purchased a silver GMC van and nicknamed it the Murder Mac. They outfitted the interior with soundproofing and a literal toolbox filled with household items, pliers, hammers, and screwdrivers. These weren't for repairs. They were the instruments of a living nightmare. Their strategy was to drive along the Pacific Coast Highway looking for teenage girls hitchhiking to the beach. Bittaker and Norris looked like two ordinary guys out for a drive. They were polite and offered rides to girls who were just trying to get home or to a party. But once the van door slid shut, the Silverbird became a prison. Between June and October of 1979, 5 young women disappeared from the coast, leaving behind a trail of grief and a mystery that the LAPD struggled to solve. What set Bittaker and Norris apart from other killers was their desire to document the suffering of their victims. They didn't just commit crimes, they recorded them on a handheld cassette player. They wanted to be able to relive the power they felt in those moments long after the crimes were over. These tapes would eventually become the most infamous pieces of evidence in criminal history. Years later, when the FBI began training new agents at Quantico, they would play these tapes to show the reality of pure evil. Many agents couldn't finish the recording, leaving the room in tears. The tapes proved that Bittaker and Norris weren't just killing for a motive, they were killing because they enjoyed the absolute destruction of another human being's spirit. The spree ended not because of a brilliant police chase, but because of Roy Norris's conscience, or perhaps his fear. Norris began to brag about the crimes to a friend, who eventually went to the authorities. When the police closed in, Norris turned on Bittaker immediately, trading a confession for a life sentence. Bittaker, the leader of the duo, was sentenced to death. He spent decades on death row, showing zero remorse and even taunting the families of his victims. He died of natural causes in 2019, while Norris passed away in 2020. They are a haunting reminder that some bonds are born in darkness, and that the most dangerous weapon a predator can have is a partner who shares their worst instincts. California, the mid-1970s. In the quiet neighborhoods of Visalia and later Sacramento, a shadow began to move through the backyards. At first, he was known as the Visalia Ransacker, a strange intruder who would break into homes just to move things around, scatter jewelry, or look through personal belongings. People felt watched. They found their porch lights unscrewed and their gate latches left open. It was a psychological game. But soon, the game turned deadly. The prowler evolved. He became the East Area rapist, attacking women in their homes while their husbands were tied up nearby. He was a master of terror who used the plates on the back trick. He would stack dinner plates on a husband's back and tell him that if he heard the plates rattle or break, he would kill everyone in the house. For years, he was a ghost that the police couldn't touch. How did a man commit over 50 sexual assaults and at least 13 murders across California without ever being caught? The answer was chillingly simple. He was one of them. Joseph James DeAngelo was a police officer. While the state was on high alert, DeAngelo was wearing a badge. He used his professional training to evade detection. He knew how to avoid leaving fingerprints. He knew how police cordons worked, and he knew how to scout neighborhoods without looking suspicious. He was a shadow cop, using his knowledge of the law to break it. Even when he was eventually fired from the force for shoplifting, he simply moved to a new city and continued his spree, eventually becoming the original Night Stalker in Southern California. In 1986, the murders suddenly stopped. For 3 decades, the trail went cold. The Golden State Killer became a legend, a boogeyman that investigators obsessed over but could never identify. The DNA technology of the 90s and 2000s confirmed that the crimes in Northern and Southern California were committed by the same man, but his DNA wasn't in any criminal database. He had no prior felony record. The case sat in boxes until an investigator named Paul Holes and a writer named Michelle McNamara decided to try something radical. They didn't look for the killer's DNA in a police database. They looked for it in a public ancestry database, the kind people use to find their long-lost cousins. In 2018, the trap finally closed. By uploading the killer's old DNA to a genealogy site, investigators found a distant cousin. From that one relative, they built a massive family tree, branch by branch, until it led to a 72-year-old grandfather living in a quiet suburb of Sacramento, Joseph James DeAngelo. Police watched him for days. They eventually retrieved a piece of trash he had discarded, a tissue, and tested the DNA. It was 100% a match. When they arrested him in his driveway, the ghost was finally seen. He was a frail-looking old man, but the terror he had sowed for 40 years was fresh in the minds of his victims. His capture launched a new era of genetic genealogy, proving that you can hide from the police, but you can never hide from your own blood.